Everyone knows that first impressions are a huge deal. Picture me judging you at this very moment. Like rapid fire, I'd be asking myself, are you trustworthy? Are you worth an investment of my time? Are you in or are you out? I'd especially be wondering if you are anything like me. But what are the cues, the actual signals that allow for us to make one decision over the other? And do they change in different settings? Whether we're meeting a blind date, applying to a job, or even trying to rent a room on Airbnb, what makes someone take a chance on you? There's nothing more first about a first impression than someone's name. And take it from me, this name situation is a pretty big deal. See, the name that I have now is not the name that I was born with. My mom and dad, they named me something different. I bet you know what you're thinking. How the hell do you begin to pronounce a name like this? Well, folks, this is my original name. It's the link to my identity, my heritage, my family. It's the thing that I used for the first 24 years of my life. Omid Rozbe Irani Nejad. So why did I feel the need to change it when this isn't a common thing that we do? But I feel the need to take a big step back. When I was newly out of college in my first big boy job, working for the federal government, I needed security clearance. Though there was a bit of a delay, and to my surprise, it was my last name that was the problem, Irani Nejad. At the time, Iran was closely associated with the axis of evil. And so naturally, my last name didn't seem to inspire trust. And I knew then that I had to make a very drastic change. But was I really willing to give up my name, this small piece of my identity, to be a part of something greater? I mean, put it this way. The potential rewards were obvious. This was the path to better job opportunities, arguably more money, right? At the very least, it would allow for me to introduce myself without a hitch. There's also something really magnetic about being able to choose who you want to be. It was almost as though I could just slap on a cape and call myself the Batman. But make no mistake, this was a hard thing to do. And it's a lot to ask of anyone. Though in time, with my mom and dad's support, I decided to change my name so that I would never have to feel as though my options were limited, and I would never again need to be questioned about my trustworthiness on the basis of something so superficial and yet so vivid. But how do you go about changing your name? I mean, what is the protocol? The researcher in me was impassioned, so very curious to figure that out. Essentially, I cherry-picked every name that ever resonated with me, and I workshopped them. I called on my friends to refer to me by these names every time we'd hit the bars, just to see how it sounded and how people reacted to me. Well, was I a Bruce, a Connor, maybe even a Jacob? I even went so far as to creating a survey monkey with my picture on it. And I asked a broader audience of individuals to identify which of these names was the best match for this mug. The people had spoken. This is not a Jacob. No offense to any Jacobs in the audience. Though Mason was the ticket. And maybe that's because a Kardashian baby at the time was recently named Mason, and their Armenian background is awfully similar to my Iranian one, thus making this entire arrangement a perfect fit. Who knows? But what I do know is that this entire experience was intense. Imagine having to overhaul yourself, your interactions with friends, family, coworkers. It's one thing to get a name, but to own it, to be it, is a task in and of itself. I was mentally exhausted, capped off by the moment with which I stood before the judge, who looked at me square in the eyes and argued that my original name was unpronounceable and that my new one was the right stuff. And with that sentiment in mind, he slapped his gavel down, and from that day forward, I became Mason Ameri, certified by the red, white, and blue. And I am not going to lie. Life in the aftermath has been poetic, fluid-like. But there were moments then when I would tell my friends that I hated my new name. I hated that I had to do this. This shift in my identity had a massive effect on my worldview. Do we really have to edit ourselves just to make that perfect first impression? And if my name caused so much drama, to what extent would other individuals go through just to appeal to the masses? The ordeal that I encountered was taxing, to say the least, but inspirational. So much so that I decided to make a career change into academia so that I could study how people manage their impression making, especially when they are problematic. And I was very blessed to encounter a professor of mine who was so heavily invested in research on people with disabilities. We spoke at great length. And I realized that a lot of what he described and a lot of what I encountered are in lockstep. I also realized that this idea of impression making and opportunity is just complicated for lots of us. I was impassioned by this phenomenon. I wanted to learn more. So I decided to create a whole fleet of fake people. I gave them names, social media presence. I even went so far as to getting them active cell phones, or as some of you might refer to these as burner phones. Now imagine the grief that I would have gotten had I tried to acquire those cell phones, of which there were some 50, 70 of sorts, with my original name. These applicants were not only rock stars, but we also had to tether the fact that they had disabilities. Those disabilities included spinal cord injury, Asperger's syndrome, hearing impairment, PTSD. And I chose these disabilities because arguably, with proper accommodations, there should be no concerns of productivity constraints. I mean, they were total rock stars, absolutely badasses, to say the least. You name it, they had it. And it should have incited an employer to want to put a name to a face, but that wasn't always the reality. So here's the good news. For virtual jobs like that of software development and data entry, a disability didn't hold people back. But in jobs like that of accounting, where P2P interactions, relationship building are mainstays, people with disabilities not only received fewer callbacks, my rock stars didn't get the interviews that they rightfully deserved. Put it this way. Picture me to be the employer. With the buffer of virtual work, because you are working from afar and I don't have to worry about your impairments and the social awkwardness that would ensue, you're in. I'd be a fool not to hire you. But the moment we lift that barrier, the fears of the unknown regarding accommodation costs and then some, compel me to respond back to you. Quote, I'm sorry the position's been filled. Even though I knew that wasn't always the reality. But it wasn't always doom and gloom. In fact, some of my studies have found that when you're disabled and you're a veteran, you don't get stiff-armed in quite the same way. Now, everything that I've shared with you thus far has been very traditional, very formalized, very systematic. You apply to a job, and you either get an interview or you don't. But we need to cast a wider net because there are new ways in which we can make money, specifically through the sharing economy. Though unfortunately, seminal laws that enforce equal access haven't quite caught up with that space, at least not without discrepancy. So I wonder, what happens when there are no rules? I was compelled to find out. So I pulled the line from my previous research and created 25 falsified accounts on Airbnb. I bought stock images of 20-somethings and manipulated them to reflect cerebral palsy, blindness, spinal cord injury, dwarfism, and one without a disability. And after nearly 4,000 lodging requests, discrimination was very apparent. So here's our baseline. The pre-approval rate for people without disabilities was at 75%, though for dwarfism, it was at 61%. Blindness was at 50%, CP was at 43%, and spinal cord injury had a dismal 25%. Evidently, the more extreme your disability, like being in a wheelchair, the more likely it is that you'll encounter discrimination, even if it's unintentional. And I say unintentional because I'm of three minds as to why we encountered the results that we did. For starters, practically speaking, some homes are not built to host people with disabilities. That's fair. But some hosts were just straight up rude. For example, does a dog drive? Or how could you see my listing if you're blind? And let that sink in a bit. And some hosts were just straight up scared, fearful of the unknowns, specifically the legal liabilities of hosting someone who has an impairment. For example, I'll have to check with my insurance company to find out if I'm even allowed to host people with disabilities. But before you start thinking that humanity is cruel, there were some hosts that were absolutely compassionate. For example, I can carry you in your chair up the stairs, or have a friend swing by and help. I'd really like for you to stay. Or this one's my favorite, dwarfism or coolism. It's all the same to us. Book it. Can't wait to meet you. That's marvelous. These are signs of hope. So in short, impression making should not be something that withholds us from lending our trust to others. Because even though you can change your name, you can't change other differences that make you, you. Folks, we need to be okay with Omid, just as we are with Mason, with the wheelchair, with the social impairments, with whatever people have to bring to the table. And absolutely, no question, acceptance takes a bit of thought. But it's not impossible, not impractical. We just need to take a moment, register the resistance in our mind's eye, and rise above it. Thank you.